The Colonel and Little Missie, Buffalo Bill, Annie Oakley, and the Beginnings of Superstardom in America, by Larry McMurtry. Read by Michael Prichard. Copyright 2005 by Larry McMurtry. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Larry McMurtry and the Wiley Agency, and was produced in the year 2005 by Tantor Media, Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Superstardom, Chapter 1. Kings and potentates, and their queens and lovers, some day die and have to be entombed, interred, or consumed on splendid pyres. So too with performers, even the greatest among them, the true superstars. Elvis died, and Garbo, and Marilyn Monroe, and Frank Sinatra. Elvis, at least, left us Graceland, his Taj on Old Man River. Of the others we have merely records and movies, recorded performances that allow us at least distant glimpses of their gaiety, their beauty, their gifts. Show business imposes its own strict temporality. No matter how many CDs or DVDs we own, it would still have been better to have been there, to have seen the living performers in the richness of their being, and to have participated, however briefly, in the glory of their performance. When I was 8 years old, I was sitting in a hot pickup near Silverton, Texas, bored stiff, waiting for my father and two of my uncles, Charlie and Roy McMurtry, to conclude a cattle deal. I was reading a book called Last of the Great Scouts by Helen Cody Wetmore, Buffalo Bill Cody's sister. At the time I was more interested in the Lone Ranger than in Buffalo Bill Cody, but when my father and my uncles finally returned to the pickup, my Uncle Roy noticed the book and reminded Uncle Charlie that they had once seen Cody. This had occurred in Oklahoma, near the end of Cody's life, when he had briefly merged his Wild West with the Miller Brothers 101 Ranch Show. Both agreed that Cody, an old man at this time, hadn't actually done much. Mainly he just rode around the arena on his white horse Isham, waving to the crowd. Still, there was Buffalo Bill Cody, one of the most famous men in the world, and they had seen him with their own eyes. 60 years have passed since that hot afternoon in Silverton. I mainly remember the heat in the pickup, but it was true that two of my uncles, not men to veer much from the strict path of commerce, did perk up a bit when they remembered that they had actually seen Buffalo Bill Cody ride his white horse around an arena in Oklahoma. And, like millions of others, they had made a trip precisely for that purpose. Such was Cody's fame. Chapter 2. Buffalo Bill and Annie Oakley were, in my opinion, the first American superstars. In the 1880s and 1890s, at the height of their fame, their images were recognized the world over. Buffalo Bill was probably the most famous American of his day. He was easily more famous than any president, more famous even than Theodore Roosevelt. Annie Oakley, in the days just before the movies took off, was as popular as any actress. One thing she and Cody had in common was that they had both killed game and sold the meat in order to support their families. Little Phoebe Ann Moses, Annie's real name, used a heavy, muzzle-loading gun to shoot rabbits and quail, which found their way through a middleman to restaurants in Cincinnati. She became Annie Oakley, Oakley being a district of Cincinnati. For most of her 16 seasons with Buffalo Bill's Wild West, she was probably the most celebrated female performer in the world. The short, slight, young, and then not-so-young country girl from Darke County, Ohio, equably took the measure of such folks as Queen Victoria, her son Edward, Prince of Wales, his wife, Princess Alexandra, the Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph, Bismarck, Kaiser Wilhelm II, and, of course, the difficult Hunkpapa leader Sitting Bull, who adored her and even adopted her, sort of. William Frederick Cody's first fame came as a hunter, of course. The slightest of his kills probably outweighed all Annie's rabbits and quail. In his season as a hunter for the Union, later Kansas Pacific Railroad, Cody probably killed around 3,000 buffalo. His wife, Louisa, usually shortened to Lulu, estimated that her husband, who with his crews of butchers usually took only the choice parts of the buffalo, may have left as much as 3 million pounds of buffalo meat to go to waste. He was not, as we shall see, either the first or the last hunter to be called Buffalo Bill, but he was easily the most famous. From the early 1880s to the end of his life in 1917, Buffalo Bill Cody was about as famous as anyone could be. He was the hero of no less than 1,700 dime novels, many of them written by the wildly prolific pulper Colonel Prentice Ingram. And in Cody's case, the fame didn't exactly die with the man. At the end of the 20th century, Buffalo Bill's Wild West was still pulling in crowds at Euro Disney in France, a country where Americans are not thought to be popular. Few showmen have managed to project their acts over more than a century. Chapter 3. In show business, superstardom of the sort achieved by Buffalo Bill and Annie Oakley needs certain preconditions to be met. In America, those conditions didn't coalesce until the fourth quarter of the 19th century. Rapid and reliable rail transport was one such precondition. At the height of its popularity, Buffalo Bill's Wild West employed more than 500 people, and transported hundreds of animals as well. The 1885 tour, the first to be really profitable, played in more than 40 cities. Later, the show made as many as 130 stops in a year. Without good railroads, the troopers could not have made these dates. Similarly, without ocean liners, they could not have become such a great international success. But the making of superstars requires more than trains that run on time to lots of cities. Management and publicity are necessary elements too, as the career in our own day of Madonna illustrates. It was always obvious that Madonna was going to go to the top, and then over the top. But she could not have got there so quickly and lucratively but for the efforts of Freddie DeMann, her manager, and Liz Rosenberg, her publicist. Fortunately, from the early 1880s on, Buffalo Bill's Wild West profited from the services of an extraordinary manager, Nate Salisbury, and a gifted press agent, Major John M. Burke, both of whom the Colonel and little Missie often frustrated. Nate Salisbury, a stage star himself, was an unimposing-looking man who did not particularly like performers and resented having to give them individual billing. Nonetheless, he happened to be sitting around the big arena in Louisville, Kentucky, one day in 1885, when a young female sharpshooter, Annie Oakley, and her husband-manager, Frank Butler, happened to be rehearsing their act. At this time, shooting acts abounded. Cody had already turned the Butlers down once. 16 female sharpshooters were even then blasting their way around America. Annie Oakley and Frank Butler had been performing with vaudeville and with the Sells Circus, and generally wherever they could get a booking. It was with some reluctance that they had even been offered an audition. But before the rehearsal was even well begun, the hard-to-impress Nate Salisbury suddenly came alive. He rushed over to the young couple and urged them to let him send them downtown to have some up-to-date tintypes made. He also immediately ordered $7,000 worth of posters featuring the young sharpshooter Annie Oakley. Later, Salisbury told Cody that Annie was a daisy who could easily put their retiring sharpshooter, Captain Adam H. Bogardus, in the shade. When the critical moment came, Annie Oakley walked out in Louisville before 17,000 people and began the brilliant career that would more than justify Nate Salisbury's surprising expenditure. For the next 15 years, with both Buffalo Bill and Annie Oakley huge superstars, Cody and Salisbury's Wild West had many glorious runs, both in America and in Europe. The show's success was not accidental, however. Both Cody and Annie understood costume and appearance. Both were consummate performers, though Cody's performances consisted mostly of showing off his own good looks and excellent horsemanship. Nate Salisbury organized the tours and hired the performers, while John M. Burke, usually known as Major Burke, hustled the press and got out the crowds. But the show had a big payroll. Some runs were profitable, and some weren't. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, competition was rampant, and things began to slow down. Nate Salisbury, who had been in increasingly poor health for some years, died in 1902. He was deeply mourned by Annie Oakley, Buffalo Bill, and many of the performers. Salisbury had been the great organizer. Cody had seldom organized anything more complicated than a buffalo hunt. As a businessman, he had been almost as bad as his fiscally suicidal contemporaries, Mark Twain and Ulysses S. Grant. Like them, he invested wildly in mines, irrigation schemes, hotels, usually in places tourists had no interest in going, and even products such as White Beaver's Laugh Cream, the great lung healer, an herbal remedy that reached drugstores roughly a century too soon. With Salisbury dead, everyone expected Buffalo Bill's Wild West to quickly collapse, but it didn't. Cody never liked working at a desk or dealing with day-to-day business details, but he could do it when he had to, and he did do it until he was able to hire another highly competent manager, James Bailey, the less well-known half of Barnum and Bailey, who, if anything, was more competent than Salisbury. Under his management the troupe had several good runs, but times were changing. There were as many as 24 troupes wandering around America, flooding the market to such an extent that the public grew weary of so much Wild West. Some companies failed outright, while others merged, but Wild West shows seemed, for a time, to be everywhere. Young Will Rogers, who would become a superstar himself, was mightily impressed by the rope tricks of Vincente Oropeza while visiting the big Chicago Exposition in 1893. Will went home to Oklahoma and began to practice rope tricks himself. Not long afterward he went to South Africa on a cattle boat, and was soon doing rope tricks for audiences that included Mohandas Gandhi himself, then a young lawyer in Johannesburg. The Wild West, in its theatrical form, seemed to be everywhere. When Henry Adams and his friend the artist John Lafarge made their somewhat libidinous trip to Polynesia, they traveled with a Wild West troupe bound for Australia. Buffalo Bill Cody continued to be much the biggest name in the business. By this time Annie Oakley had retired, though she re-emerged from time to time to compete in shooting contests, nearly all of which she won. Cody liked Indians, and from the beginning hired far more of them than any other impresario, though this involved frequent difficulties with the Department of the Interior and the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, whose wards the Indians were. Eventually Cody supplemented his Indian performers with horsemen of many types, Cossacks, Arabs, and so on, whom he called his Congress of Rough Riders of the World, a nomenclature Theodore Roosevelt would eventually appropriate. Cody and Annie Oakley traveled together for 16 seasons, and were always respectful of one another, if not exactly close. She always addressed him as Colonel, the rank he had more or less adopted for himself, and he always called her Missie, though she was a married woman for more than 40 years. Annie Oakley liked her privacy, and Cody, as we'll see, never knew quite what to make of any woman, Annie Oakley included. It may be that these courtesy titles helped the two performers get along. Chapter 4. It seems to me that the best way to characterize these two linked but very different human beings, Bill Cody and Annie Oakley, is to start with a brief description of their funerals, which were absolutely in character. Buffalo Bill lost control of his own death, just as he had by this time lost control of large patches of his life. He was not even buried until 5 months after his death, and then wasn't buried either in the place or in the manner of his choosing. By contrast, Annie Oakley died as precisely as she shot, even going to the trouble to secure a female undertaker to embalm her. As her hour approached, she picked out an apricot dress and told the undertaker, Louise Stocker, the only lady undertaker in that part of Ohio, exactly what to do. Louise Stocker did as instructed, though, since Annie had suffered from anemia and was very pale, she did take it upon herself to add a little color to her cheeks. In our day we have come to expect superstars, particularly female superstars, to behave badly, at least to the help. Martha Stewart and Courtney Love spring to mind. But this was not always so. Both Buffalo Bill and Annie Oakley were deeply loved, not least by their help. Here is a comment by the American artist Dan Muller, whom Bill and Lulu Cody took in as a fatherless boy and helped raise at Scout's Rest, their big place near North Platte, Nebraska. Buffalo Bill was one of the world's great men. I don't mean wise, but I do mean great. His heart was as big as his show tent, and as warm as a ranch-house cook stove. Around his supple body there was an aura that people loved to share, whether they were Edward the King of England or the lonely tyke of a penniless widow, Muller himself. We who loved him, we who didn't depend on his largesse, suffered as weakness gradually caught up with that warm, magnificent man. And here is Annie Oakley, when she learned of Cody's death. I traveled with him for 17 years. There were thousands of men in the outfit during this time, Comanches, cowboys, Cossacks, Arabs, and every kind of person. And the whole time we were one great family loyal to one man. His words were better than most contracts. Personally, I never had a contract with the show once I started. It would have been superfluous. There, little Missie exaggerated a bit. She had contracts, meticulously negotiated by her husband, Frank Butler, and she herself probably read every line of the small print. But the sentiment was true. Cody inspired extraordinary love and loyalty. Even sometimes bitter rivals, such as Gordon Lilly, Pawnee Bill, knowing that Cody had no head for business, tolerated much foolishness while remaining fond. Many were happy to cheat him, and did. But there were more who loved him. Perhaps Black Elk, the Ogallala sage, who went to England with Cody in 1887, got lost, was found again, and sent home by Cody. He recognized how homesick the young man was, said it most simply. Pahuska, Cody, had a strong heart. Buffalo Bill Cody was outgoing, generous, gushing, in a hurry, incautious, often drunk, and almost always optimistic. In manner, Annie Oakley was his polar opposite. She was reserved, modest to the point of requiring a female embalmer, so frugal that many of the troopers believed that she lived off the lemonade that Cody and Salisbury served free to all workers. Quakerish, quiet. But she, like Cody, was a show person through and through. Even after a bad car wreck, rather late in her life, she once got on stage and danced a jig in her leg brace. Annie Oakley was also about as competitive as it is possible to be. No sooner had they got to England for Queen Victoria's Jubilee than a vexing diplomatic problem arose. Grand Duke Michael of Russia, a confident wing shot, proposed a shooting match with little Missie. Cody and Major Burke, the publicist, were horrified. "Of course you mustn't beat him," they urged. "He's a Grand Duke." Nate Salisbury, made of sterner stuff, favored a real contest. Frank Butler kept very quiet. He knew better than to suggest to his wife that she throw a match, any match. In fact, on her first English tour, Annie Oakley was occasionally beaten, but only because she had too heavy a gun or used shot too light for the gusty English shooting conditions. In the contest with Grand Duke Michael, she missed 3 birds out of 50. The Grand Duke missed 14, but evidently there were no hard feelings, and a good time was had by all. So far as I can determine, Annie Oakley never let anyone beat her. Her first biographer, Courtney Riley Cooper, put a question to the young Texas sharpshooter Johnny Baker, whom Annie loved, mothering him and helping him in many ways. Although technically a rival, she even helped him improve his act. She was later to be just as fond of his daughters. "Johnny," I asked, "tell me something. When you used to shoot against Annie Oakley, and she always won, was it because you weren't trying, or because she was a better shot than you?" "There was never a day when I didn't try to beat her," he said, "but it just couldn't be done. You know, the ordinary person has nerves. They'll bob up on him in spite of everything. He'll notice some little thing that distracts his attention, or get fussed by the way a ball travels through the air. Or a bit of light will get on the sights, or seem to get there, and throw him off. I wasn't any different from the average person, but Annie was. The minute she picked up a rifle or a shotgun, it seemed that she made a machine of herself. Every action went like clockwork. And how was a fellow to beat anybody like that? To tell the truth, it would have made a better show if I could have beat her every few performances. But it couldn't be done." When Annie retired, Johnny Baker, who had long been like a son to her, became the principal shooting act for Buffalo Bill's Wild West. Annie Oakley cloaked her competitiveness under her modest demeanor, but plenty of people who worked with her knew it was there. She made no secret of her dislike for Lillian Smith, the chubby California teenage sharpshooter whom Cody brought into the show. Technically, several of the sharpshooters Annie performed with should have been able to beat her, but they rarely managed to. Like Johnny Baker said, she could become a shooting machine, and the others couldn't. Competitive or not, Annie Oakley, like William F. Cody, was faithfully and deeply loved, both by her audiences and by her friends. Near the end of her life, when she was at home in Dayton, Ohio, still plagued by her leg brace and suffering from anemia as well, a man who was by then a great superstar himself, Will Rogers, who had been playing Dayton, took notice and paid her a visit. At the time, he wrote a daily newspaper column called "The Worst Story I've Heard Today," which ran in more than 200 newspapers and reached some 35 million readers. Soon he would go on to become the highest-paid performer at 20th Century Fox. Here is his tribute. This is not the worst story. It is a good story about a little woman that all the older generation remember. She was the reigning sensation of America and Europe during the heyday of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. She was their star. Her picture was on more billboards than a modern Gloria Swanson. It was Annie Oakley, the greatest rifle shot the world has ever produced. Nobody took her place. There was only one. Then, it being an innocent age, he actually gives his 35 million readers Annie Oakley's address, so her old fans can write to her. Then he adds, "She is a greater character than a rifle shot. Annie Oakley's name, her lovable traits, her thoughtful consideration of others will live as a mark for others to shoot at." She died on November 3, 1926. The story immediately went out to the world over the AP wire. The story said, among other things, that she was the friend of monarchs and the confidant of her old boss, Buffalo Bill. Her husband, Frank, ill himself, had gone to Michigan to recuperate. When news reached him of Annie's death, he stopped eating. 18 days later he died, just in time to be placed in the grave beside her. Here's Cheryl Casper's report. On Thanksgiving Day, November 25th, Annie Oakley made her last trip past the old public square where she had sold her quail and rabbits to G. Anthony and Charles Katzenberger so long ago. The old home folks carried her remains up north, past Ansonia and Versailles and the fields and forests that were so familiar to Annie Oakley. Just south of the village of Brock, they turned off Highway 127 into a little cemetery hemmed in on all sides by fields and trees. Up North Star Way, just 5 miles distant, the rabbits scampered over the field and the quail darted from their covey, just as they had done years before when the girl Annie Moses sat on a moss-covered log with Jacob Moses's old Kentucky muzzle-loader across her knees. The forests weren't so thick any more, but still this quiet farmland was home to Annie Oakley. They buried her under a plain headstone that bore a simple inscription, Annie Oakley, at rest, 1926. Chapter 5. In contrast to little Missie's modest burial, the big farewell to Buffalo Bill Cody, on top of Lookout Mountain, near Denver, in June of 1917, was, in its way, his final Wild West show. Cody had actually died in January, but could not be buried until June because Lookout Mountain was, after all, a mountain. It could not be reached by motorcade until after the spring thaw, which meant June at the earliest. Cody himself had planned to be buried on top of Cedar Mountain, near the town of Cody, Wyoming, a community in which he had sunk and lost millions, but which he loved, and was loved by anyway. His last years, like the last years of many showmen, were rich mainly in humiliation. He fell in debt to many people, some of them honorable like Pawnee Bill, but also to others who were merely exploiters, like the Denver newspaper magnate Harry Taman and his sometime partner Frederick Bonfils, who worked Cody to a frazzle in this show and that circus until the old man was near to dropping. But even in shabby settings that Cody would not have so much as sniffed at in his heyday, he never quite lost his commanding presence. He hated Taman, and sometimes reflected that he ought just to kill him. Surely a tempting thought, since Taman had once sold all Cody's assets, including his horse Isham, at a sheriff's sale. Taman held Cody in contempt, but that didn't stop him milking the old showman for all he was worth. When Johnny Baker, performing in New York, heard that Cody was dying, he got on the first train, but arrived at the bedside of his idol just a little too late. At a few minutes past noon on the 10th of January, 1917, Buffalo Bill Cody died. At once the news went out over a special open telegraph line to all the world, and much of the world mourned. President Woodrow Wilson at once sent condolences to Lulu, and the King of England soon followed suit. Harry Taman, who had exploited Cody so ruthlessly while he was alive, saw no reason to stop just because the man was dead. Somehow or other, either with bribes or with flattery, Taman persuaded the grieving widow that burying Cody in a remote village in Wyoming would really be a loss to the nation. Few would journey to distant Cody to see the great man's grave, but many, indeed millions, might come if the grave was in easy reach of Denver, where, of course, they would be free to do some shopping and perhaps buy a copy of Taman's newspaper. One way or another, Lulu was persuaded, and when the snows thawed in June, a lengthy procession made its way, with much grinding of gears, up to the rocky gravesite. Gene Fowler, the excellent, too-little-remembered newspaperman who gave us a fine portrait of John Barrymore in Goodnight, Sweet Prince, and a moving one of W.C. Fields in Minutes of the Last Meeting, happened to be working in Denver at the time. For Harry Taman, in fact. He went to the funeral and left this wonderful report. 6 of the Colonel's old sweethearts, now obese and sagging with memories, sat on camp chairs by the grave hewed out of granite. The bronze casket lay in the bright western sun. The glass over the Colonel's handsome face began to steam over after a while, on account of the frosted pane. One of the old Camille's rose from her camp chair, with a manner so gracious as to command respect. Then, as if she were utterly alone with her dead, this grand old lady walked to the casket and held her antique but dainty
Sample complete. Ready to continue?